Chapter 1451. Edward waved his hand to ask his secretary to leave. She walked out and closed the door. He walked to the couch grumpily. "You're too arrogant, kid, coming up here to talk business with me. Let me ask you, who is one Saldana to you?" Since Edward went straight to the point, Ian didn't hide. "He's my father." Edward paused. "Isn't his son Marco Saldana? Since when did he have another son?" Ian laughed. "Would he tell the world that he has an illegitimate son?" Edward paused again. People who had influence would not admit they had an illegitimate child because that was frowned upon. The children could only live in the shadows and could not be brought to life. They were very much taboo. Edward didn't keep questioning him. The son from Juan Saldana's marriage had mental issues and would not be able to inherit the family business, so it would be different if he had an illegitimate son. However, Juan didn't seem like someone who would let an illegitimate son take over his empire. Otherwise, why would he hide his existence from the world? Edward hummed. "Since you're his illegitimate son, why do you think you qualify to come and talk to me? You probably don't have control over Synergy, and as far as I know, one would never pass down the accomplishments and status he worked for go to someone who doesn't have the birthright. I don't need that from him." Ian adjusted his watch while looking calm. "A company that's involved in illegal funds would only be a hot potato to me. The Hydra Bay Company's investigation isn't a coincidence. He doesn't want to see me urgently because he wants a successor. He just needs a scapegoat." Edward was a little surprised. He looked at him curiously and asked after a moment, "You seem to know that, but since you're not doing this for Synergy, why are you here? And how could you promise to give my daughter 5% of Synergy's shares? What if I transferred the shares?" "Transferred?" Edward looked at him, seemingly angry. "You know that Juan is struggling to protect his company. If you transfer the shares to my daughter, aren't you just transferring the hot potato to the Xaviers? You want us to be the scapegoats?" Ian chuckled. "If that were the case, why would I suggest a marriage of convenience?" Edward didn't reply. "Synergy's source of income is legal. Mr. Saldana wouldn't be dumb enough to use his own company. They will find nothing from the accounts because he has a few offshore private accounts, and the accounts are under Marco's name." Edward was shocked. "How do you know that?" "An offshore private account to move the funds from the company. Anyone who ran a company would know what that meant." However, how had Ian found out about something so obscure? Ian looked around and fixed his eyes on the dial. "I'm from the ministry." Edward fell silent. After Ian left, Edward called his secretary back in. She walked to his desk. "Yes, sir?" "Get someone to look into Ian Summers at the ministry. He had to find out who he really was for safety reasons." Maisie picked a present from the antique store in Dawn Garden and bumped into Barbara and her mother-in-law, Christina Hill. Christina saw her coming out of the antique shop, so she smiled and asked, "Picking a birthday present for Nicolas?" Chapter 1452. "Yes, we've had too many presents in the past, and I'm out of ideas now. Then I realized I haven't gotten him any antiques yet." Christina nodded and had a short chat with her before leaving and letting the young people spend time instead. Barbara had tea with Maisie at a cafe nearby when Maisie remembered something and blurted, "I think I saw someone today." Barbara asked, "Who?" "Ian Summer." Once the name came up, Barbara froze. It had been a while, and she didn't seem to remember much anymore. "Where did you see him?" "When I was on the way here. It was just a glance, but I felt he looked familiar." Maisie said that while her eyes were on Barbara's face and chuckled. "Why? Do you still have a thing for him?" Barbara rolled her eyes. "Nonsense. If Helios hears this, he's going to be so jealous." "It's fine then. It's been so long. I thought you would feel bad if I mentioned him." "No way." She didn't feel bad, but there was regret in her heart because she liked him so much. Maisie asked her, "Does Helios know about this?" "No. Barbara held her teacup but didn't drink. I never told him. Tell him before any misunderstandings begin. I just want to point out that he's in Bassburg. Maisie didn't have any intentions of mentioning Ian other than wanting Barbara to accept her past. Everyone was young once. When Ian handed Glitz to her, he didn't say goodbye to Barbara when he left. Barbara must have felt some regret about that. Now that she was with Helios, everything in the past would just stay in the past. She reminded her that Ian was in Bassburg so that she would be prepared if they bumped into each other. Barbara got home, and the nanny said Helios was spending time with Beatrice upstairs. She walked to the study and saw Helios holding Beatrice in a chair. He looked helpless when Beatrice started doodling on his documents. When Beatrice saw Barbara, she held out her hands and said in her baby voice, "Mama." Barbara walked over and took her into her arms. "Baby, your daddy's documents have turned into your doodling pad." Beatrice grabbed her dress. "I'm hungry." Helios laughed and stood up. "She's hungry. I'll get the nanny to make her some food." He called for the nanny. The latter walked in, took Beatrice from Barbara, and went downstairs. Barbara suddenly hugged Helios, who paused and touched her hair. "Weren't you at Dawn Garden with Mom?" "Yes, we were." "How was the movie?" She smiled. "I didn't understand it, but Mom enjoyed it." Helios hugged Barbara, and she looked up at him after a while. "I need to come clean about something." Meanwhile, at Black Gold, Quincy got some news from Mr. Washington that Mr. Saldana was looking for his illegitimate son. Nolan put down the documents and looked up. "He's looking for his illegitimate son?" "Yes, I'm guessing he wants his son to be a scapegoat. Based on my intel, the fund that Mr. Saldana stole wasn't in his books. He's really cunning. All he wants is for Synergy to be safe. Even if he was investigated, all the numbers would be correct. All he needs to do is lay low for a while, and he will be fine." Chapter 1453. Quincy was impressed by his tactics. He would still have a chance as long as he survived, and that was why Synergy had never been investigated. They would never find anything suspicious. The numbers in the public account would not tally with the earnings of Houston. Nolan chuckled. "I guess he has other accounts." Quincy scratched his head. "I've checked the casinos, and the accounts under his name were clear. There was no extra money." Nolan frowned. Look into his illegitimate son. He wanted to get this done quickly and didn't want to complicate things, so he had to first make sure that the illegitimate son would not be in his way. At that moment, Nolan received a message from Helios. "You're an asshole for tricking me." At the Goldman mansion. After showering, Nolan told Maisie about Helios cursing him out. Maisie was applying her skincare at the dressing table and burst out laughing. When she had taken over Glitz, Nolan insisted on transferring it to Helios. Now that Barbara had confessed to Helios, Nolan had to take the blame. She got up and sat at the edge of the bed and couldn't help but laugh. Are men usually that petty? She was glad that Barbara had come clean, or Helios would be really jealous. Nolan pulled her into his arms and pinched her chin. "Why are you so happy that I got scolded?" She blurted, "I'm not happy. My heart aches." Nolan didn't believe her. Maisie hugged his waist and chuckled. "All right, that's enough. It's been so many years, and that chapter ended long ago." Nolan held the side of her neck and kissed her. "I would be jealous if you had something like that too." Barbara had never told Helios about Ian, and now that she did, and Ian was in Basbo, Helios would feel threatened as her husband. Still, it was better that he found out now rather than finding out that this was hidden from him. Jealousy was unavoidable, but if she came clean, at least they could deal with it together. Maisie chuckled, her eyes beautiful like the night sky. "I'm not like you. You're always the one who's attracting others." Nolan was silent. "Now that our children follow in your footsteps, I'm afraid I will have too many sons and daughters-in-law." He smiled, then pinched her nose. "I've set my rules. My daughters-in-law must be as pretty as you are, and my son-in-law must be better looking and richer than I am. Maisie paused. Why is it harder for the son-in-law? Because we only have one daughter. Elaine and her colleagues were having a meal. The colleagues were having a great time, and their private room was very hyped, but Elaine was drinking along in one corner. She put down her glass and got up to get some fresh air. She walked past a room, and the people inside saw her walk past and thought that she looked familiar. Mr. Saldana, I've seen the girl who just walked past at young Master Saldana's cafe. Juan's face dropped. Bring her in. The man nodded and walked out. Elaine stopped in front of the elevator when someone called out to her. She curiously turned around, and her expression changed. He was the man asking to see Jan at the cafe the other night. Ma'am, our director would like to meet you. Could you come with me, please? Elaine squinted at him. Your director, is Mr. Saldana? The man realized that she knew who he was, so he smiled. Since you know him, you should come with me then. Chapter 1454. Elaine followed the man into the room. There were only 5 people, and Juan sat in the middle. The man next to him was pouring him a glass of wine. Mr. Saldana, she's here. The person next to him asked her to take a seat, so she walked over and sat down as a courtesy. How may I help you, Mr. Saldana? Juan poured her a glass. Are you close with Ian? She replied, I know him, but we're not close. He chuckled. How well do you know him? Elaine casually replied, I know that he's your son out of wedlock. Mr. Saldana's expression froze. If he told you that, you must be special to him. He handed the wine glass to her, and she took it out of courtesy. At that moment, the door of the room opened. The man standing outside looked at Elaine, who was sitting next to Juan. Why are you here? She wanted to say that his father had invited her, but Juan left before she could. I heard you're quite close with this lady, so I wanted to meet her. Ian walked to the table, picked up the wine bottle, and poured himself a glass. I haven't had a drink with my father before. He filled the glass and took a drink first. Juan filled up his own and then said, Are you showing me courtesy because of this lady? Elaine was surprised because she didn't know what this had to do with her, but she kept her eyes on Ian. Ian calmly poured himself another drink. I wanted to introduce your future daughter-in-law to you, but you invited her in before that. Elaine was stunned for a few seconds. Future daughter-in-law? She didn't remember confirming their marriage of convenience. Juan frowned. You're getting married? Ian held the empty wine glass and smiled. Aren't you happy that I'm getting married? Juan looked at him. Ian was just an illegitimate son to him, and all he could do was be his scapegoat. It didn't matter who he got married to. Since the family business wouldn't go to him, Juan didn't need Ian's marriage to bring in more benefits. He laughed. Of course, I'm glad that you're getting married. He got up and asked someone to fill their glasses for a toast. Ian, if you're getting married, come back and live with us. I'll help you plan your wedding. Ian smiled, but his expression was hard to read. Thank you, Father. After staying there for a while more, Ian brought Elaine away, and Juan didn't stop him. Once they left, the bodyguard asked Juan, Do you want me to look into that woman? Why? Juan stared at him and smirked. He's just an illegitimate child. No socialite would be interested in him. He had looked into Ian's past. He had a small business at the market and also worked with the mob. They were jobs that people weren't proud of. The women that he dated were people Juan would never take a second glance at. This woman he was going to marry seemed to be different from the others, but it seemed like another woman trying to marry into a rich family. Why else would she know who he was? The street lights lit up the car as Ian was driving Elaine back. His hands were on the steering wheel while he looked forward. You just went with him because he invited you in? Chapter 1455. Elaine had her hand on the side of her forehead. Isn't he your father? Ian's face tensed. He has never treated me as his son. She parted her lips but didn't say anything. She had noticed that the relationship between Ian and his father was interesting. Rather than father and son, they were pretty alert around each other. She turned to look at him. Why did he ask to speak to me? He didn't answer, but asked, what do you think? Because I know you? Why else? Elaine chuckled. Then why did you tell him that we're getting married? Wouldn't he take the chance to ask me for drinks then? He wouldn't. Ian was certain about his answer, and that surprised Elaine. What do you mean? Because he thinks that it wouldn't be worth his time. Elaine looked at him. You know him very well. Ian stopped his car at the red light and looked at her. It's not always a good thing when I know someone very well. She paused and didn't answer. Ian was undercover once, so he had to know who was going against him before he went under. His cover would have been blown if he hadn't taken time to know who he was up against. One needed to know their enemies well enough to have the upper hand. Some people thought that they were better than everyone, were arrogant, and thought they deserved what they had, so they looked down on others. People like these wouldn't be good leaders. They would just be empty cans. The light turned green, and he continued driving. Elaine stayed quiet for a long while. You're not important to him, because you're just an illegitimate son, right? He wouldn't waste his time on an illegitimate son, especially when he thinks that the women I dated weren't presentable. He wouldn't be ashamed of that either. Juan had never announced who Ian was, so it didn't matter who he married because it wouldn't be related to the Saldana. He just needed this son to do what needed to be done, which was why it had taken him so long to search for him. After enjoying the benefits and lying low overseas, the purpose of the illegitimate son would come to light. Elaine pressed her lips together. All she heard was all the women he dated. Have you dated a lot of women? The car stopped outside the gates of the Xavier mansion. He pulled the handbrake and turned to look at her. On the surface, yes. You asked them for a marriage of convenience as well? No. She was curious, what then? He calmly said, because my job required that. He put his arm on her backrest and leaned forward. Do you mind? Elaine paused, then snapped back, looked away, and smiled. This is just a formality, so I wouldn't mind. He lowered the car window and let the cool breeze blow at his collar. He turned off the headlights and sat there in the dimly lit night. It was quiet in the car, and the sexual tension of two single people sitting there together would have devoured everything. However, he never thought about it that way. Elaine broke the silence. Have you spoken to my father? He nodded. I did. And? He didn't object. Elaine was a little surprised. What did you speak to him about? Ian smiled. It's a secret. Tisk, you have a secret together? She opened the door and stepped out. I'm going in. Drive safely. Chapter 1456. Elaine walked past the car and entered the courtyard. Ian watched as she walked inside. After a short while, he started the engine and left. A few days later, Quincy returned with some information about Ian. However, when he handed Nolan a copy of the information, he frowned when he saw the name on it. Ian Saldana. As he flipped through the document, he said, "This name rings a bell." Of course. He was the boss of Glitz, replied Quincy. Nolan did not say anything. Meanwhile, Edward was equally surprised when he found out Ian's identity. He had his secretary go confirm Ian's identity at the ministry. Ian had indeed been a member of the ministry and was once an undercover agent of the higher-ups. He used fake names when he went on missions. He had also served as the head of the crimes unit when he was young and had excellent abilities. He would have been the deputy director by now if he had not resigned. Just when Edward was immersed in his thoughts, someone knocked on the door. He placed the document down and said, "Come in." The one who came in was one of his employees. He stood at the door and said, "Mr. Xavier, Mr. Saldana is here." Ian and Edward talked for half an hour in the office. When the conversation was over, Edward politely walked him to the elevator. "Jan, find a time and have Elaine bring you to our home for a meal." Ian stopped in his tracks, turned around to look at Edward, and smiled. "I'm free at all times." At that moment, the door to the elevator opened, and Elaine was standing inside it. She wanted to ask her father about something, but she did not expect Ian to be there as well. Edward looked at her and smiled. "Elaine, right on time. I've told Ian to have you bring him back for a meal one day." She looked at Ian and came out of the elevator. "It's done?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Ian smiled but did not say anything in return. "What do you mean by it's done?" Edward frowned. "Didn't you like him very much and want me to agree to your marriage?" "So, I said yes now. Since his daughter wanted to get married, he had to say yes to it." Elaine was shocked. "Since when did I?" "Let's announce our engagement in these 2 days." Ian interrupted her with a smile on his face. He then turned his head around to look at Edward. "What do you think?" Without waiting for Elaine to say anything, Edward thought for a moment and replied, "Sure. Let's do that." Elaine seemed to have been excluded from their conversation. She wanted to say something, but neither of them gave her a chance. After Edward finished speaking, he returned to his office. Elaine chased after Ian into the elevator and asked, "What did you say to my father?" Edward thought that she wanted to have a marriage of convenience with Ian because she wanted to marry him. Therefore, she wanted to know what Ian had told her father, which caused him to misunderstand her. He even said, "I like him." Standing in the elevator, Ian pressed the floor button and replied, "Your father has agreed to our marriage. Isn't that what matters the most?" She was stumped. "Yes, I'm very happy about that, but we're just having a marriage of convenience. I want to know what you told my father." She couldn't convince her father because they were just having a marriage of convenience. Since Edward had agreed, it meant Ian had agreed to give her father some benefits, which was what she also wanted. However, from what her father said just now, it seemed to her that he was not aware of her intention at all and purely thought that she wanted to get married. Ian looked at her and smiled. "Do you think your father would say yes if I didn't tell him that?" After that, the smile faded from his face as he added, "Rest assured, I know we're just having a marriage of convenience, not a real one." Elaine's engagement soon spread over the city. Many people congratulated Edward for the 2 good things that happened to his family when they met him. First, his stepdaughter had started a relationship with Nolan's cousin-in-law, and now his daughter was getting married. It was a double celebration. Chapter 1457. When Maisie was having a meal with Barbara in the restaurant, the latter told her about the engagement of the Xaviers. "Elaine is getting an engagement?" Barbara looked at her and asked, "You don't know about it?" Maisie did not say anything. It went without saying that she knew about the engagement. It was just that she did not know to whom she was engaged. After all, the Xaviers kept the identity of the man a secret. She couldn't help but imagine the scene she would see that day. However, she did not expect the scene she imagined to come soon. As they left the restaurant after finishing the meal with Barbara, they bumped into Ian and Elaine in the corridor. Both of them had just come out of the elevator. Elaine was walking beside him with her head held low. Then, she bumped into Ian's back and subconsciously raised her head. She saw that the people standing in front of them were Maisie and Barbara. Barbara froze in her tracks. When she met Ian's gaze, she was stunned, and a surge of mixed feelings rose from the bottom of her stomach pit. It was not because she had not gotten over him yet or missed him. It was just that she still couldn't forgive him for leaving without saying goodbye to her that year. Ian pressed his lips thin. Even though he was the one who purposely avoided her, he was still swarmed over by a myriad of feelings when he met her again. Elaine looked at Ian and sensed something. "Mrs. Goldman, what a coincidence." Elaine took the initiative and greeted Maisie to ease the tense situation. Maisie smiled and replied, "Yeah. What a coincidence." She looked at Ian and said, "It has been a long time, Mr. Summer." Ian returned to his senses and nodded at her with a smile. Yeah, it has been a long time. He glanced across Barbara, but the latter averted her gaze as she was not prepared to face him yet. She tugged at the hem of Maisie's clothes. Maisie looked at them and said, "We've finished our meal, so we'll be going first." Elaine nodded. Barbara rapidly walked past them with her head held low and entered the elevator. When they were in the elevator, Maisie looked at her and asked, "Are you still mad at him?" Barbara was stunned for a moment before swiftly saying, "Not anymore." She was not mad at him at all. It was just that she used to love him that much, but he had vanished from her world all of a sudden without giving her any reason. She would be lying if she said she did not blame Ian for his actions. She felt sad and aggrieved as well. When they came out of the elevator, Maisie stopped and turned around to look at her. "He told you the reason 3 years ago, right? The reason they couldn't be together was due to his identity. Ian was an undercover agent. His missions were incredibly dangerous, so he had to set aside his personal feelings. Despite having a crush on a woman, he could not be with her openly. When someone met the right person at the wrong time, it was destined that they couldn't be together." Barbara sighed. "I just hadn't mentally prepared to face him yet. It was too sudden." After all, she did not expect to run into him here. Maisie put her hand on her shoulder and laughed. All right. I suggest you wipe that expression off your face. Don't act like you still haven't gotten over him yet. If Helios sees you, he's going to get jealous again." Barbara was rendered speechless. Barbara was the only person who knew how severe the consequences were when Helios got jealous. After confessing to him that day, she nearly couldn't get out of bed the next day. In the past, she did not know that Helios would be so possessive, and it was only now she found out that men were the same. In the meantime, in the private room, as Elaine stirred the soup in front of her, she lifted her head to look at Ian. She had noticed Ian's reaction when they bumped into Maisie and Barbara. It was just that it was none of her business, so she did not ask. However, women were gossipy. Her curiosity was tickling her, prompting her to ask him about it. "It seems to me that you have some unknown past, Mr. Saldana." Ian's hand froze in the air. He met her gaze and chuckled lightly. "I thought you said we shouldn't meddle with each other's private life?" Chapter 1458. "I'm not meddling with your private life," Elaine replied as she rested her chin on her palm. "I'm just curious about it." "It's a whole different thing." Ian did not reply. Since he did not reply, Elaine was even more confident that he must be hiding something. After all, women's intuition was always right. She took a sip of her soup and continued. "If you're worried that I might go around and tell everyone about your past, you can rest assured. My lips are tightly sealed. However, if you still refuse to tell me anything, I won't force you either." He laughed and said, "Thank you for your understanding, Miss Xavier. I'm going back to my company after the meal." "I'll leave the engagement banquet in your hands, Mr. Saldana," said Elaine. "Let me take you back." She was stunned. "I don't think that's necessary, right? Well, even if our marriage is fake, we still need to put on a show. Don't you think so?" Ian replied flatly. Elaine fell silent. Ian sent her back to J Tech Incorporated. He watched as she walked into the office, before driving away. When her colleagues saw him, they all gathered around her and asked if he was her fiancé. After all, he had sent her to the company himself several times, and he only left after she came in. He treated her so well, and all of them were envious of her. Elaine fell silent for a few seconds before replying with a smile, "Yeah. He's very nice to me." Other than his identity and his personal feelings, Ian was perfect. A week later, the engagement ceremony of the Xaviers was held in the banquet hall of the Rosenberg Hotel. All guests attending the banquet were friends of Edward who were deeply involved in the business and had come to congratulate Edward. As Edward's soon-to-be son-in-law, Hector was invited as well. As for Maisie and Nolan, both of them were present too. After all, there was no way Nolan would let his wife attend an occasion like this alone. Many people were envious of Edward. He had not done anything, yet he became one of Nolan's extended families, thanks to his son-in-law. Nolan was swirling the wine in his glass as he stood insouciantly amongst the crowd. He was not interested in the engagement ceremony. He was there because of his wife as well as because he wanted to meet Ian. Maisie was talking to Lucy and Hector. Lucy did not seem so happy about Elaine's engagement. Instead, she looked a little worried. Maisie noticed it and asked, "What's wrong?" "Huh?" Maisie's question successfully pulled Lucy back to reality. She gave Maisie an embarrassed smile and replied, "Nothing. Today was Elaine's engagement ceremony." She figured that she shouldn't make any comments that would kill the mood. Besides, she knew that Elaine wouldn't take it seriously either. Maisie knew that she had something to say. She more or less could guess that it was about Elaine. However, since Lucy refused to say it, she did not press on. She squinted and looked at Edward, who was talking with someone happily. Honestly, she was kind of surprised when she learned of Elaine and Jan's engagement. At the same time, Elaine was still inside the dressing room. She put on a pair of tassel earrings and looked at herself in the mirror. She rarely put on makeup, and she would only wear light makeup on important occasions. Since it was her engagement ceremony, her makeup tonight was much more delicate. When she looked at her reflection in the mirror, she felt she was looking at someone else instead of herself. She was wearing a white, bare-shouldered dress with crepe silk sleeves. The dress wrapped her body like a glove, and the hem looked like a blooming flower. It was sprinkled with tiny fluorescent sheets as if it was studded with countless rhinestones. Someone from the outside knocked on the door and asked, "Miss Xavier, are you ready?" "Yeah, I'm ready." She retracted her gaze and took a deep breath. She kept telling herself that this was just an engagement ceremony and that there was nothing to be nervous about. She pulled the door open, and when she turned her head, she saw Ian talking to the staff in the corridor. He was tall and stood out a lot amongst the crowd of staff with his distinctive white suit that did justice to his body physique. Chapter 1459. A white suit was harder to pull off than a black one. Not only did it require the wearer to have a good physique, but the wearer also needed a good appearance. Ian wasn't tanned or pale. He was in the middle, but the color white fit him perfectly and made him look like he was glowing under the light. It was mainly because of his good appearance. He looked mature and regal, despite wearing a light-colored suit. He only turned his head around and looked at Elaine walking toward him when someone noticed her. All the staff left, leaving only the two of them in the corridor. Elaine stopped in front of him, and nobody knew if she was nervous, but she seemed a little stiff. "Isn't the ceremony about to start?" "Yeah," he replied softly as he studied her. "This dress looks good on you." Elaine lifted her head and met his gaze, but she soon averted her eyes. "Thank you. You look good in the suit as well." He moved to the side and said, "Shall we go in now?" She nodded, and Ian extended his hand toward her just when she was about to walk away. She was stunned for a moment, but she still lifted her arm and warped it around his. Sensing her stiffness, Ian laughed. "I didn't know that you'd be nervous as well." "Do I look like the type of person who wouldn't get nervous?" "Yeah." Elaine glanced at him and asked, "Are you not nervous?" "Well, a bit but still manageable," he replied. Elaine did not say anything anymore. "There's no way he can be nervous. He should be even more experienced than me in handling this kind of situation, right?" Both of them then slowly walked into the banquet hall. Everyone turned their heads around and looked at them. Some of them were in awe, while the others were praising them. Most of them were envious of Edward. After all, both of his sons-in-law were very good-looking. All of their daughters had been looking for partners like Ian or Hector, and both of his daughters had found them. They walked up to Edward, and Edward began introducing his son-in-law to the people around him. Ian responded to their questions and greetings with practiced ease and a smile on his face. Nolan squinted. "He's Ian?" Maisie chuckled as she was standing beside him. What's wrong? Are you still upset because Helios scolded you because of him? Do I look like a petty-minded person to you? Yeah, you do. Nolan did not say anything anymore. Then, Ian and the others walked toward them. Ian took a glass of wine from the attendant and approached Nolan with a faint smile on his face. I've heard a lot about you, Mr. Goldman. I guess this is the first time we see each other, right? Nolan had run a background check on him before. Since he did not sense any hostility from Ian, he replied politely, what a coincidence. I've heard of you before, Mr. Saldana. Ian was not surprised. You've heard other people talking about me, Mr. Goldman? Nolan took a sip of the wine and replied, yeah. Ian laughed and continued. Well, it's my honor that you can remember me, Mr. Goldman. Nolan put the empty glass on the table and said indifferently, I didn't expect you to be Juan Saldana's son as well. Ian lowered his face when Nolan mentioned his father. The expression on his face remained the same as he said, it doesn't affect anything, right? Nolan could read between the lines. He lifted his head and looked at him. Seems like you're a sensible man, Mr. Saldana. I have always been like this, Ian replied with a smile. There's nothing more reliable than benefits, not even family. Although this sounds harsh, it's the truth. Nolan chuckled. You're smarter than I think you are, Mr. Saldana. Ian summarized the relationship between him and his father in just a few words. If Juan were given the chance to pick benefits or family, he would pick the former without any hesitation. If it were not because Juan needed Ian, he would never have come and looked for his son. Even now, Juan still does not know the true identity of his illegitimate son. After all, he had always been looking down on Ian, and it was exactly because of his disdain and ignorance that his selfishness and arrogance had been exposed. Chapter 1460. Elaine turned her head around to look at Ian, who was talking with Nolan right now, and pressed her lips. Lucy came up to her and said, Eli. She turned around and replied, yeah? After Lucy whispered something into her ear, Elaine put the glass on the table and exited the banquet hall with her. Maisie stood at her spot as she watched them exit the hall. On the balcony, Elaine stood behind a flower pot covering half of her body. Let me guess. You're going to talk me out of this again, are you? I just think you've made a rash decision. Are you sure you won't regret it? Crossing her arms in front of her chest, Elaine said, even if I'm going to regret it, it's my own business. Lucy lowered her head and said, I know. I know I shouldn't say something like this to you at your engagement ceremony. Even though we're not related by blood, you're still my sister. I truly hope that you can find your happiness. Elaine remained silent. Eli, I know you're just having a marriage of convenience with him, but are you sure you're not going to fall for him? Huh? Elaine looked at her in surprise. What are you talking about? Fall in love with him? Are you kidding me? Lucy continued helplessly. Initially, I believed that you wouldn't either. But after seeing Mr. Saldana tonight, I just realized that he's exactly your type. Elaine liked mature and well-mannered men, and Ian was exactly the type of man she was looking for. Therefore, Lucy did not believe that Elaine wouldn't fall for Ian. Elaine suddenly let out a laugh. After a short while, she said in a serious voice, Girl, do you think I'm that kind of shallow woman? Yes, you're right. I like mature and well-mannered men, but even if he's my type, it doesn't mean I will fall in love with him, okay? I'm still sober enough to differentiate what's real and what's not. She liked good-looking men and was certain that no woman would fall for a mature and well-mannered man. However, she was not someone who put all her eggs in one basket. Besides, she was very well aware that everything happening right now was fake. There was no way she would fall in love with Ian, and it was the same for Ian. Therefore, why would she invite trouble to herself? Lucy took a deep breath and said, All right then. I have nothing else to say. After that, Lucy left the balcony, leaving Elaine alone. She placed her hands on the handrailing and looked toward the sky garden through the window. Nobody knew what she was thinking right now. She had to admit that Ian was the type of man she liked. She also did not have the confidence that nothing would happen between them after some time. However, one thing she knew was that if she ever fell in love with Ian, it would be like falling into an abyss. She stayed on the balcony for a while before returning to the banquet hall. Ian had been clinking glasses with people who came to congratulate him. Even though he had been drinking a lot of wine, he looked perfectly fine. After the ceremony ended, a few people brought Ian into the car. He leaned back in the back seat and loosened 2 buttons on his collars. He tilted his head back and rubbed his nose with his hands. Edward asked Elaine to send him home. After all, she was his fiancée right now, so she had to take care of him. She entered the driving seat, and the entire car reeked of booze. She looked at him through the rear mirror and asked, "Where do you live?" Ian looked at her through the slits of his fingers and said, "North Bay Avenue, South Park, building number 22. South Park in North Bay Avenue was a townhouse district. It was considered an old town. It was far from downtown and close to the suburbs. However, it was quiet and not as noisy as downtown. Elaine drove the car toward North Bay Avenue. None of them talked to each other throughout the journey. The car was dark, and she couldn't see Ian's face clearly through the rear mirror. "So, you'll get drunk as well. I thought you could hold your liquor very well." "I can only drink occasionally," he replied, his voice deep. She licked her parched lips and asked, "Is there something bothering you?"